This episode is made possible by our generous patrons.
Welcome to the Ink to Film podcast, where we read the book.
And then see the movie.
I'm Luke.
And I'm James.
And this week we discuss Matthew Quick's 2008 novel, Silver Linings Playbook. Alright, man, Silver Linings Playbook. This is my first time reading this, and I have not seen the movie, so it was my first time experiencing this story, and I had a great time with it. But you've seen the movie already, so your experience is definitely going to be different than mine.
Yeah, it was interesting. Very similar, which is kind of to be expected with a story like this, but a little darker, I think. A little more...
Really?
I feel like we were able to get a little more into Pat's mind.
Oh, cool.
For sure.
Okay. Well, before we get into it, I think we're going to do this episode a little different. First thing we're going to do is do a little bit of housekeeping, talk about some stuff that's been going on with the podcast, and then after that, we're going to do a spoiler-free general discussion about Silver Linings Playbook. So if you haven't seen it or read it, or you're just curious about the story, you can stick around, listen to all of that. You'll be totally safe from spoilers. And then we'll get into a brief bio about the author, which will also be safe. And then we'll get into a spoiler discussion, which we'll definitely shout out when we get there.
So, I mean, the first thing to mention with this whole project is this episode and the following episode, the book and the movie coverage, was funded and paid for by one of our jukebox heroes on Patreon.
That's right. Stephen E. chose this project. I think he said it was one of his favorites, and he wanted us to cover it. And so we're doing 2 episodes for him. It's taken him a few months to earn up the tokens, but hopefully he enjoys this. And this is our premier tier reward, right? Like we literally are doing this podcast because he paid for it. I would not have... I mean, it was on our list, but like it was way down. I don't think we would have covered it this year. So this has definitely changed what we were going to do, and I'm having a lot of fun with it.
It was definitely one that I would have wanted to do at some point, but the fact that somebody decided this is what they would want us to cover, I think it's cool.
Yeah, and hopefully this might inspire a few more people to think about it. Clearly, it's a lot. It's $25 a month, which is a considerable amount. And you got to save up some tokens to equal the amount to the project, which we have listed on our jukebox directory on our website. You can see the cost of all the different projects. But this is like the coolest reward we thought we could give, right? Like a devoted podcast to somebody's project. Clearly, it's a good bit of money, but it's also extremely generous because you're helping this show. And if you're a fan of this show or you listen to this show and you like it, it's the strongest way to keep it going. Now, certainly not for everyone. It's clearly only for people who can spare $25 a month, which is not everybody. But if you can, think about it if you like this show, because it's a really cool way to affect what we do. You can introduce us to something that isn't necessarily on our radar, because that often happens with me. If I know nothing about a project, it won't really be on my radar, and that's kind of how this one was for me.
So yeah, just once again, huge shout out to Stevie for being a jukebox hero, and seriously, like, all props to you. We appreciate it.
Yeah, and if you want to find out how to become one or just look into it and see what we're offering, go to patreon.com/inktofilm, and you can view our different tiers. We also have lower tiers where you can just spend $2 and get access to all our bonus content, which we just put out, Fahrenheit 451, the 1966 version, which I get to learn all about French. Was it the French New Wave?
French New Wave.
Yeah, so I knew nothing about it, and we got to talk about that movie, so that was fun on our bonus content. So yeah, if you want to find out how you can get access to that, check it out as well.
Another Patreon related thing that we Luke and I decided that a goal that we wanted to try to strive for was making our podcast more inclusive and allowing people who are hearing impaired to participate and listen as well. So a huge shout out to Jennifer Delazana. I mean, I just can't even believe the generosity. It's just like, I was blown away when she said that she was willing to help us out. This, because it was a long-term goal, to have it happen so quickly is awesome.
Yeah, we decided we wanted to make our podcast accessible to anyone who wanted to access it. And one of the ways to do that is to start doing transcripts. So we started looking into what that would cost, what that would be like. Everything we were seeing was pretty cost prohibitive, but we thought, okay, we can just make it a Patreon goal, and we can get there, and hopefully we can do it. But yeah, someone I went to school with at Seton Hill, I believe she graduated a little bit before me. But yeah, we've met at cons. She's great, and she offered to help out. So we decided we're going to kick her what we can right now, which is not much. but we didn't want her working for free. And then eventually, if we can hit the Patreon goals we added to the list, what we'll do is we're going to up her pay, and we're going to have her start going through our back catalog. Right now, it's going to just be new episodes going forward. So that'll be cool, and people can check it out. Also, you can follow along. Like, you can pull up the transcript and be able to read while listening. Some people enjoy doing that, and it helps them. So hopefully it'll be useful for all sorts of people, not just the deaf and hard of hearing community.
Yeah, again, I mean, I just want to say again, extremely generous of you, Jennifer. So thank you so much.
Yep, thank you. All right, so I think we're ready to get into our general thoughts. Once again, this will be spoiler-free. I will try my best not to spoil anything. This book, I really enjoyed reading it. I had a good time. I think there was a certain, I mean, it's called Silver Linings, right? And that's kind of Pat Peoples' motto, and his philosophy is to look for the silver linings in things, or to hope for the silver linings, or expect them even. And I found that outlook on life to be refreshing, even in the midst of a lot of darkness going on in his life.
Mm-hmm. I said before, I've seen the film, so coming in, I was expecting something, and I got something different. And I gotta say, it wasn't quite as heavy as I thought it was gonna be. It was definitely, I just, coming from the movie, was expecting it to be, I don't know, a little more, but I did enjoy it. And I think the thing that really stands out for me is the characterization.
Wait. A little more what?
I think I was expecting it to have more of like a heartstring pull to it, where it was like way more suffering, much more heartache. And although it's very clear that numerous characters in this story have mental illnesses, I was just feeling maybe something from the movie made it feel like it was going to be. I think I was expecting it to be a little more forced. But at the same time, I think the thing that really stands out for me is the characters and the characterization. Because I felt like in the movie especially, the love story was a little more loose, and like kind of, it was like a mental illness film with a story of with a love story blossoming in between, and kind of like how messy that can be, and how like true to life it can feel. I was expecting the book to be like, this is a mental illness book, and I think it was more subtle than that. Okay. If that makes any sense.
Now, well, I mean, I haven't seen the movie, so it's hard for me to make any comparisons to that. But speaking on just the book, there was a comparison that leaped to mind to me that actually made me laugh a little, because I thought, this is going to be a ridiculous thing to say, but I'm going to say it. When I was reading this book, I thought, especially in the early pages when I was first reading it, this reminds me of Patrick Bateman.
Oh wow!
American Psycho, and not really, but like in form, because it was a first-person book, and we were inside the mind of someone who was unreliable,
right? And
who was telling us things that clearly didn't jive with reality, and I started doubting everything he was saying, and then it was clear that he had some sort of anger problem. Yeah, it was funny, because I started thinking of Patrick Bateman, but clearly this guy was way more likable, and so there was like it was a distinct difference. Like, it was like two sides of the same coin, and I don't think this guy's a psychopath, whereas Patrick Bateman is. But it was showing that a mind that you can't trust to accurately report its own reality. And in that sense, it reminded me of that. We also got early on, we got some long descriptions of like football stuff. And they weren't nearly as long as Patrick Bateman's beauty regimens and stuff, but it reminded me of that too. It was like this thing that it was almost like Pat was trying to show how much he knew about it, because he thought that's what people expected of him. But I wasn't sure how much he actually enjoyed it. Anyway, so it was funny, because my start with the book was I was thinking very much of American Psycho, which is a very different novel than this.
Right.
And I won't linger on it too long, but I just thought it was funny that those comparisons were jumping to mind for me.
Something you said was he's more likable than like a Patrick Bateman. And I think, to circle back to the point that I was trying to make before, I think that he's even more likable in the film. So to me, it's like this story is showing someone who, what I was expecting was a story that was about mental illness, and it was going to feel like maybe a little preachy and saying like people with mental illness are people as well. But really, when I read the novel, that's not what it was. It was, I think it did a good job of kind of showing, especially with like his father, Pat's father in this, kind of showing how people try to struggle through mental illness sometimes and cope with it without seeking treatment, and just it becomes like normalized in their lives. And I think that that's something that Pat has had to deal with, but because he was in a more extreme situation, it was like amplified, and then he had to, seek help and take medication. Earlier I said it was like kind of darker than the film. I think it also, we get like the perspective of somebody who is, like you said, like unreliable and seemingly, like, although I don't think that he's a bad person in any way, clearly has a track history of being potentially dangerous.
So should we maybe set up a little bit of what like the premise is without spoiling what happens? Because I feel like right now we're talking in a way about a character that if someone hasn't read this, they're not going to have any idea what we're talking about. So do you want to explain like who Pat Peoples is, just like from the premise, from the get-go?
He was a teacher who had something go on, and when we first meet him, he's being released from a psychological ward. We're getting it from his viewpoint, so we're kind of seeing him manipulating the system and the doctors and his mother into like letting him out, even though he is. We can tell as the reader that he's not 100% ready to be on his own in this kind of way.
The narrator is being released from a mental institution, and we're told he has psychosis and he can hallucinate and all this stuff. And when I'm told that in a novel, I immediately go, okay, anything that he's telling me may or may not actually be happening. Mm-hmm. Now we're getting his reality, because his reality is what he experiences, right? Mm-hmm. So in that sense, it's true. Like I didn't think he was lying to us, but I was thinking that what he is experiencing might not be what is actually happening. So I am going to be interested to see how the movie handles that, because that's by definition different in a movie, because I feel like we've talked about this before, but I feel like the camera has a sort of a indifferent gaze where it's like, this is real when you're watching it. Obviously there are tactics to play with that, but I just wonder how that might be changed, because this story felt right to be told from his perspective. And like you were talking about the themes of whether or not he should be out, or what his life, what the kind of quality of life he can have, and all of that. I think that's all baked into the story in a way that's really natural.
So I don't think it's too much of a spoiler to just kind of mention the football aspect of this story, and also kind of his obsession with fitness and working out. And this, again, it's like, maybe this is part of the reason why it kind of made you think of Patrick Bateman, is his like regimen.
Oh yeah, you're right. The workout regimen.
And how it's like the most important thing to him. Like he wakes up and he's every time that something's going on in his life, he's planning his fitness circuit, whatever he's gonna do before he goes to like watch the game or visit his family or see people. What do you think that is like? What is that signaling to us, the reader, when we get that early on?
What is that signaling?
Like, so the football and like is there like some toxic masculinity in here? Is there like some sort of like obsessive compulsive thing?
Yeah, I didn't get the toxic thing as much. I think Bateman is definitely sort of demonstrating that, but here I think it's more about obsession. I think a lot of this book is about obsession, and a lot of it is about coping mechanisms. And I think his working out is an obsession for him and also a coping mechanism, because as we learn, he's convinced that if he's in like the best shape ever, that's going to convince his wife, which we don't know the history of what happened with him and her, but he has something called a part-time, which he's currently in right now, and for whatever reason, and he thinks that'll end a part-time if he can get into just like supreme shape. So it is also kind of like working towards his ultimate goal, which he is also obsessed with. So he seems very obsessive to me in a lot of ways, and especially in this particular fashion. And I think it shows how extreme behavior can come out of that. And he doesn't just work out; like he works out to an extreme amount. Like you said, like he's wearing trash bags, he's running 15 miles a day before he does weight benches and stuff. Like he works out so much. And I'm hoping that when I see Bradley Cooper in this movie, he's going to be jacked. Because when I was picturing this character, I was like, holy shit, this guy's going to have to be in insane shape. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Don't spoil it for me. Did you get something else out of the workout aspect?
I just think that the way that he's obsessed with fitness and being in great shape and being strong, and maybe also the way that his dad is obsessed with the Eagles, maybe that stems from his father as well as his wife. The reason why he's wanting to be in great shape for his wife.
Right. So I see what you're saying. So it's like maybe he grows up in this family where his father is obsessed with all of these athletes, and to him, there's a lot of worth associated with being athletic, and we see that reflected in a lot of his thoughts about other characters. Right. Like he's constantly thinking about someone else's build or their athletic prowess or whatever it is, and that circles me back around to a couple of observations I want to make about Pat Peoples as a narrator. One, he's deeply flawed. Now he's not Patrick Bateman flawed, but he's got a lot of like questionable beliefs. I think there's some sexism baked into there. There's definitely some privilege, but I think he also is sort of aware of it, and I love his little mantra where he's like, this isn't a spoiler to say, but he says, I'm trying to be, what does he say? I'm trying to be kind and not right.
Mm-hmm.
And he says that repeatedly throughout the book. And I think that mantra is like a really powerful one. And I think it reflects how he's fighting against sort of these other things that are going on in his head.
Another thing that pops up in this book is kind of he has another obsession, and I think that's with like educating himself with a specific literature and kind of like trying to educate himself and be well informed about specifically like high school literature. He keeps finding himself not agreeing with these stories being told to young people. So I found that fascinating too.
Right, because he doesn't like that the books have sad endings often or are depressing. But yeah, that reminds me of another part that made me think of Patrick Bateman. These descriptions of like classic literature where he gets into the plot and he reacts to all of that, and it's very like, it feels kind of beside the point. And that was the kind of thing Patrick Bateman would do with his music reviews, right? Where he would talk about 80s pop music. Like I said, it's interesting that these parallels kept coming up to me, but clearly very different characters once again. Also, the name Pat Peoples to me sounds like what is it, like Joe Everyman? It's like, right. Essentially might have been this guy's name. So I'm actually not a big fan of that name because I feel like it's too on the nose. Mm-hmm. To me it feels like the author trying to say like, hey, wink wink nudge nudge, this is all of us, isn't it? That's
another thing that I wanted to say, is that I think that nearly every named character in the story, whether it's been diagnosed or no matter what it is, I think every character has some level of mental illness to them. We can get into it more in the spoilers, but I thought that's interesting because like clearly, yeah, he's supposed to be this everyman, and we're supposed to, not all of us have as severe of like, I think everybody deals with something. I think that it's interesting that the author was basically trying to make us sympathetic with almost every like aspect of mental illness through this story.
Yeah. And I like that. I just think the name might be a bit, and to my sensibilities, it might be a touch too on the nose. But I love the idea of it, right? I think that's very clever. Before we really get into it, actually, let's do author bio. Let me talk a little bit about Matthew Quick. I only know a little bit about him, and then we'll get into our full spoilers. So one of the reasons I do want to talk about him a little bit is the story that I read sounds to me like this sort of modern authorial daydream that a lot of people have, and it's like the thing they wish they could do. And what's crazy about it is that it worked for him. Mm-hmm. So from what I've read, basically he grew up and lived in New Jersey, went to college, studied English, creative writing, got an MFA, I believe, and then he started teaching high school English. And I've heard him say in interviews that he was depressed and unhappy with his life, and started thinking how he really wanted to write a book. He decided that he was going to quit his job and move into his, I think, step-parents' basement and work on his book for 3 years and just totally devote himself to it. This is the book he wrote. And I think he also traveled some, from what I read. Like, he maybe traveled a little bit before he moved into the basement. He came out with this book, and it was literally a dream come true. But what's crazy is also, I read 70 different literary agents turned it down.
Wow.
Which is insane. So it also shows perseverance, and I don't know how many revisions it might have gone through during that course of time, but the idea that he stuck with it, believed in this book, and finally made the deal, and then this book was optioned and made into a major motion picture with Robert De Niro and Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence, and it hit bestseller, and he became a New York Times bestseller when the movie came out. It's literally a dream come true for people. The idea that like he chased his dream, he just kind of gave it all up and committed himself to it, and then hit a bestseller list, and now he's gone on. He's written several more novels, I think several young adult novels and adult novels, and has really just crafted this career out of nowhere. And it's incredible. And, props to him for being able to do it. It's I think it's a dream for a lot of writers.
Now, I think we try to stay away from this usually because I think I think we've talked about it before. It's a little short-sighted. But I think we have to mention the fact that how much of himself was he putting into this novel? Because he was clearly an English teacher who was dealing with a mental illness, depression. So how much of himself is he putting in these characters, and like how much do you think that? I think it clearly informed the novel a lot, but
so much of it. I think the culture, I think a lot of the people, and it's not just Pat Peoples. I think that would be the mistake, is to assume that he is Pat Peoples. He's
Right.
not. He's kind of everybody. But we see. I guess we're not in the spoiler territory yet, but we see certain characteristics from his life apply to certain other characters throughout the book. And yeah, I think he's all over this book. It's very autobiographical, in my opinion. It seems to me like somebody who's been struggling with depression and is trying to find a way through, and focusing on silver linings was perhaps his way to do that. And then it's crazy because his life had that silver lining, at least, of actually achieving his dream. So yeah, pretty incredible. And I think he is all over this book.
Yeah, I agree. I don't know if he necessarily went through like the relationship struggles,
Yeah,
like
I don't
know.
think so from what I read. I think he was happily married, but I don't know.
But that just goes to show that like he was at least, well informed enough to write on these subjects, and I think he did a good job of kind of portraying multiple different. Because what do we get specific diagnosis for Pat?
I don't think we ever do, not specifically.
I don't know enough about psychology to really know, but do you have any idea? Like, what would you like? Is it just anger?
Well, it's spoilers to talk about, so
Okay.
let's save it.
Okay, let's save it.
We can talk about it as soon as we get in the spoiler section. So, is there anything else you want to talk about with sort of this novel before we get into that section? Otherwise, we can get right into it.
I think I'm really ready to move into spoilers, man. I got so much to say.
Yeah, we've been avoiding talking about Nikki as much as possible because I think she's a major plot point, and I wanted to just kind of reveal my journey through this book with her character in particular.
Okay.
I was convinced that she was a figment of his psychosis or his delusion, and that she didn't exist. I had that thought. I wrote it down on page 25. I was like, oh, there's going to be a reveal that she's not even a real person, right? And because everybody in his life was lying to him, and it started to become obvious. And it was also like it seemed like he had false memories. I was told he's hallucinatory. I didn't really know the level of his illness, his mental illness. So it was like, I think there was a lot there for me to kind of go down get in the weeds on that one.
I gotta say real quick, I don't know how healthy it would be to lie to somebody in this kind of situation. Also, it seems really irresponsible to me that everyone around him is lying to him. But
and I think he does that on purpose, because to me it felt like people are all lying to him in the sense of like a white lie. Like they all think that their lies are helping him. And I think that's very true to life, to people who have mental illness, is that they feel like people around them are walking on eggshells and are lying to them in ways because they're afraid of upsetting them. And it shows how what a bizarre life that can create for somebody when nobody's telling you the truth. Now, granted, he can't handle the truth, to quote Jack Nicholson. But
I want the truth.
But he can't, really. Like, he wants to know, but then we see when he hears something, he loses it, and he flies into a rage, and he's dangerous. I don't know. So yeah, I think that is interesting.
Your journey with Nikki through the novel.
Thank you. Yes. So Nikki, about halfway through, I was like, wait a minute. I think she is real, but I think she's dead. So that was my next thought was he was in some sort of accident and she was killed in this accident. And so now everyone's is lying because she's not actually separated from him, but she died. But then I was like, I don't know. The more I thought about that, it didn't really make sense, because I was like, unless maybe he caused the accident, I guess was my reasoning as to why they would lie and try and make him think that she was just separated.
Right.
Because maybe they thought he couldn't handle the guilt. But this is the kind of like mind games I was playing with myself, trying to figure out what the truth was. And it was interesting. I think maybe because, I hadn't seen the movie, so I didn't know, so, and then when we started getting the letters through Tiffany, at first I was like, oh, so she is real. And then after about like the second letter, I was like, no, maybe this is just Tiffany making something up and playing into this. And so then I actually was kind of onto that because that is revealed to be the case. But it was weird because like everything had been a lie up to that point, to where it was like, I don't even know how Pat could believe that at that point. Like, it was like everybody had been lying to him about everything.
Everyone is constantly lying to him. And it just, like I said before, I just think that that's like highly irresponsible with someone like this, because although they may get angry, at least you'll know, instead of it being a situation where like he finds out that Tiffany was lying about the letters, and then like what kind of anger, what kind of like lashing out that's going to create.
Well, we saw early on that he like hated certain people. Maybe not hated, but like he seemed like he had a strong, intense dislike for certain people, like Veronica and his former doctor, and like certain people. And it seemed to me that the reason he didn't like them is because they were the people who were unwilling to lie to him.
Yeah.
And they would tell him the truth, and that truth would anger him so much, and he'd say like, I can't believe they said that about Nikki. And,
right.
Clearly to me, it's just them saying like, she's not coming back to you. But what I thought was like, they said Nikki's dead or Nikki doesn't exist. And either of those two things were just incompatible with his worldview. So then he just decided he didn't like that person because they like made up lies. So I don't know. It's like, it's twisty because you say it's irresponsible, but I don't really know. I think it's like, I feel like there is some of this makes sense. And it's like, lie by omission, not mentioning certain things. Like some of it makes sense, but then like, it's just so messy because when everybody starts doing it and maybe does it too much, I think it does create a problem too, where somebody doesn't know what to believe.
And think about the oh shit moment of the reveal that 4 years had passed when he was in there, and he thought it had only been a year. Like that doesn't feel like a white lie to me. Like you're messing with somebody's life, and like his mom taking the pictures down in order to kind of make it seem like that time certain things hadn't happened or there weren't, you know what I mean, to push things from the foreground, and kind of like make him think that, his brother wasn't married and all of these things that he missed out on. And I don't know. It just seems like a big length to go to keep somebody in the dark. And it's kind of just like treating them like a child.
Definitely he's infantilized in this, which is totally something that if you've ever been hospitalized or injured for a long period of time, if you've ever been disabled in any way, this is definitely something that you can feel. And you can feel like people are treating you like a child. And I think it does happen accidentally sometimes, like people don't think about it. But I definitely see that here. So you asked me earlier what I thought his diagnosis was, and I'm not a doctor and I don't know. But what I do know is what was revealed in the book, which is that he slipped or was pushed perhaps and hit his head on a faucet, is what it seems like. And that caused enough trauma to his brain that he forgot a lot of stuff, which that definitely happens. Amnesia can be caused by this. But then it also seems like it created some sort of almost like a psychosis or an imbalance in his brain as well, like an emotional imbalance, and it changed his emotions, which that absolutely can happen too. There's a famous case in psychology with the guy who had a piece of rebar go through his brain, and he survived. And you know about this, right?
I've heard it, yeah.
Yeah. And so he survived and was fine, other than it completely changed his personality. And everyone who knew him talked about how nice he was. And then afterwards, he was a huge asshole. And so it's interesting because to me, he doesn't seem like a huge asshole. He seems like maybe he has impulse control, but in a lot of ways, he seems like a better person. So that was the other thing that made me think that maybe he was just lying to us, the reader, is when he kept talking about himself from when he was in his marriage and how he acted and how he treated Nikki. To me, it didn't sound like him. It sounded like a different person. So I kept thinking like this is all invented. But I guess it was him. I guess he was just like a huge dick to her. Because like when he describes how he used to be, it sounded pretty awful, honestly.
Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of like what psychologically he could be suffering from, because it's like the hallucination stuff was from the medication, right? It wasn't necessarily
could be from the medications. Yeah.
So there's that, and then he clearly had anger issues. He clearly had maybe he was like bipolar in some way. Although I didn't really see the shifts.
But I don't think you can get bipolar. I don't think you can get. I don't mean to be wrong about this, but I don't believe bipolar is one that you can get from head trauma.
Yeah.
So that's the thing too. Like this is caused by head trauma. As far as we know, he didn't have any mental illness before this.
Mm-hmm.
Now maybe he did, but and maybe this just exacerbated it. I don't know. I feel like I'm a little bit out of my depth trying to really get into this because I'm not a doctor, so I don't know. I'm not a psychologist. It might just be like a kind of a fictional, stew of psychosis and, amnesia that served the plot. Right. That's probably what it really is.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. So you were saying how you think everybody had a mental illness in this story. And I agree, and I can see it in several. I mean, obviously Tiffany has got, it's revealed that a lot of her problems are what's going on with her, which I think a lot of her is like depression and then trying to deal with loss and sort of the trauma of a traumatic event and a traumatic loss in your life. And it was very tragic. And then the father, who I suspect is going to be played by Robert De Niro in the movie, is got his own problems. Like this is like a guy who's abusive and lets the like wins or losses of the Eagles affect his entire week. And what's interesting is like both of us are NFL football fans. Mm-hmm. And so it's like I kind of you identify with it somewhat, but then you see like this is taken to an extreme. Yeah. And like, I'll be in a bad mood for like an hour sometimes after my team loses, maybe even a couple. But I realize that it's because of the team, and then I'm able to kind of like shake it off and be like, well, I just got to get over it and have the rest of my day.
Well, when you're a Bucks fan, it's just that constant burden, so you just bury it deep down, and you never. I don't let it affect my days because it's.
You don't have to talk to me about that. As a Jaguars fan, I know loss well.
Yeah. I mean, we've been bad for so long that I don't really let it affect my days anymore. But I mean, it is one of those things where it's like. The rituals that like the chants that they were doing and how seriously he took it. He would come into his son's bedroom that he wouldn't talk to other than to do the chant in the morning to make sure that everybody's got the mojo right.
I love that part. Like that was the most it was like a heartwarming part for me. And it's interesting because like written all over the front of this book is like heartwarming tale and stuff. And I didn't find it to be necessarily that. Like I didn't know if I would necessarily describe this as necessarily like a heartwarming tale, other than the fact that those moments it showed how something like that can bring you together and how it can help give a common interest to unite people, and how it can like strengthen family bonds. And I don't know, there was just certain things about that was really cool that I thought worked well with the NFL side of it, which we didn't even like really talk about, like how the NFL really affects the story, but I think that's one way in which it does.
I think some of what I was talking about before with like the toxic masculinity is like the way that they talk about like a Giants fan coming into an Eagles stadium wearing the jersey or something like that, where it's like, and I understand like the tribal nature of it, but at the same time, it's like it's taken to, and like we've all heard stories like that, and we've seen videos of unruly fans,
especially with Philadelphia.
Got him.
I know, but seriously, man, that's like I think they're the most infamous fans for this sort of thing. I could be wrong. Maybe the Raiders are right there too, but I think Philadelphia fans are. I mean, they're famous for like booing Santa Claus and all this stuff. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but again, like that's like clear. That's all those characters. That's a mental illness. Like they clearly have, like if you're willing to have that mob mentality to like attack someone or like surround someone and like people take it really seriously. So that's another thing.
Well, I mean, I think you can differentiate between like an actual mental illness and like a momentary group insanity. because like mob mentality stuff. Because I think some of that comes into play, which is different than like true mental illness. But I see what you're saying though.
The another one that I wanted to talk about was unfortunate. It was his mother, and the way that like
So
the go ahead.
Well, no, I'm asking what would you say? How would you?
Oh, I don't know exactly what I would say it is, but I would say just like her forgiving nature and the way that she's like she enables the son, she enables the father into being the people that they're being. And it's like an unfortunate true situation that happens. But her willingness to like forgive after she was like standing her ground, and she was saying like I'm not gonna clean anything, I'm not gonna do anything, and then I think like the Eagles won, and then all was forgiven, and they were like having sex or something, right? They were like,
yeah, which was interesting because I kept thinking that the father was going to be kind of like not the villain of this story, but if there was one person you could point to as a villain, it was going to be him, because especially early on, like everything he did was like despicable to me, and almost unforgivable. And but it's also, I think, trying to show the strain this can put on a family, and like I get that, but I mean, like he's beating his son, his mentally, impaired son, for having an episode, essentially, right? And like I know that, like
he was getting violent with the mother, though, right?
So there's a trade-off there, but I mean, he punched him. Like the father was literally punching him. So I don't know. It's wild. And then just the way he does truly seem to hate him at times, and how it's like, can't you have some compassion? And then the fact that I later found out that this was caused by an accident. It was caused by him. And also, like, the nature of the accident, like, he caught his wife, having sex with someone else, broke it up, and then, like, fell and hit his head in the course of that. It's crazy to me that the father isn't more sympathetic.
Well, I think that it's the father is just selfish. Like, I feel like it's like he sees the son as not being what he wanted him to be, and, like, an inconvenience to him.
And there's your toxic masculinity, right? Like, there's the idea that, like, my son has to be this, like, my ideal version of a man who's going to be normal and fit into all of these, like, boxes I have for him, and do and behave in exactly the certain way that I find to be acceptable. And if he's not that, I don't know how to relate to him, because that's the only way I know how to relate to anybody.
Right.
And so to me, that is like a sad part of it. And I don't know. It's interesting how, like you said, when the moment where he and his wife reconcile, it seems to me that the book sort of says like, and now all is forgiven. And I didn't really feel like he had earned that as a character. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Cliff, because I think Cliff's really interesting too.
I love Cliff.
The psychologist. He was fun, and I don't know how professional a lot of the stuff he does is, but I thought it was a ploy, right? Like him being a Eagles fan and stuff. I thought like maybe he liked him okay, but like that was really like he was playing it up to connect.
That's
what
I thought
no,
too,
he's like driving a bus and stuff. Like he's legit. And I thought that was really funny. And I don't know. I really liked him, and I'm going to be really interested to see who they cast to play him, and how that turns out in the movie. Yeah,
and I do think it was a good tactic to connect to Pat, because so clearly it did work for him. We were seeing it from Pat's perspective, and he's like, I have the coolest therapist in all of Philadelphia, and he's just so obviously that did help. Let's talk about his obsession or lack thereof with Kenny G. And like the way
that, oh my god, so funny. Mr. G, he calls him Mr. G, was the best.
Yeah. I don't remember if it's exactly the same in the movie, but the way the way that it's explained, how was it explained in the book? Remind me.
Oh, like the reason for it?
Yeah.
I don't think it was ever explicitly explained, but in my own headcanon, and I think this is supported by the text, is that the smooth jazz rooms, when he was in the bad place, would often play this song. And this song that was smooth jazz was also the song that was played at his wedding ceremony, which that was definitely in the book. And then so it would remind him of the wedding ceremony, which reminds him of the infidelity and everything else. And so that song became very linked to a very terrible moment in his life. And then like, it's just so funny that it it not just about the song, but about the musician, and then like he was literally haunting him at night and like showing up in his room to play like saxophone in his bedroom and stuff. Like, it's so good.
It is really good. Yeah, the way that like if he hears it or if they even speak of the bad man or his music or anything, and he like is so obsessed with the fact that like he hates that guy so much because it reminds him of things. Also comes back around to the literature stuff, the way that he just cannot. He invests himself so heavily in the literature that, and he like puts his own life on that he can't cope with the fact that these characters are having, you know, unhappy endings, these endings that are just not so bleak, and the fact that he can't understand why those are important kind of shows like where he's at and why like he's not gonna, until he realizes, and I think we kind of get that until he realizes like you take the good with the bad, and silver linings are all great, but it's not always going to be like that. The real world's different. I think that's like his growth as a character.
So I want to talk. I think one of the really fascinating things for me as a writer, at least, was the theme and sort of he gets into it with his therapist, I believe, about why do we read depressing, dark fiction. And I think that's a really interesting topic. I think we should save it for the end of this, though, because I want to like get through all this story and then like as a summing it up and talking about that kind of fiction versus what this kind of fiction is, or purports to be at least, and maybe like different purposes they serve. But I think it's about time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to divide up the plot into 3 sections here, and I'll just briefly go over it, and we can kind of react to each chunk. So, a former history teacher who has moved back into his childhood home after spending time in a Baltimore psychiatric hospital, Pat, believes he has only been away for a few months, but soon realizes it has been years, and struggles to piece together his lost memories and what has become of his wife, Nikki. He has a hypothesis that life is a film created by God, and that its silver lining will be the end of part-time with Nikki. Pat embarks on a plan of self-improvement in order to win Nikki back. At a dinner with his friend Ronnie and his wife Veronica, Pat is introduced to Tiffany Webster, who has also moved back home after losing her job after her husband's death. Okay, so that'll be the first chunk here. That's kind of introducing all the major characters, and I think gives us an opportunity to talk a little bit more about Tiffany and her role in this novel, because we don't actually ever get her side of things, other than what she says and then the letters that she has created as Nikki's. Well, so she actually wasn't talking to Nikki on the phone. She actually never spoke to her, right? Like, It was all just pure invention. Yeah, that's right. So those are all just purely from Tiffany, which is interesting, right? It kind of recontextualizes them, and it makes me want to go back and revisit them because they get a different meaning when you know for sure. Because I suspected, but knowing for sure that she's just wholly inventing it is interesting.
Well, and it's like the knowledge that she has of like the school system and the way that they're teaching, like she like does the research to trick him, and clearly she thinks that this is gonna be the thing. Like, you know what I'm saying? Like in one of the letters, she talked about Nikki, but Tiffany talked about how the school now has like an online service where teachers can check in and check the grades and that kind of stuff. So for her to know that stuff, to put it out in a letter, she did all that research in order to trick him. So clearly she thought that this was the right thing to do, but I think the initial reaction is that she selfishly was doing this to trick him into being like, okay, I don't care about Nikki anymore, and then kind of like open his eyes to Tiffany.
Sure. So back up a little bit. What did you think of her character and her own tragic backstory?
I think that this is the part that, like, on the front of the book it says heartwarming and stuff. I think that this is the part that I don't know that it's necessarily very heartwarming for me as much as it's like, I think that it's nice that it's more of like one of these true to life stories, or something that you would a story that, you know, everything's messy in real life. So for these two characters to meet in this way and to have all of these problems and to kind of find each other and at first not really, like, clearly Pat at first has other things on his mind, and then to slowly come around on it. I think that it's nice that these two quote unquote broken characters find each other and like find some sort of salvation in that. Her character specifically is interesting because it's not that I think that she's aware that she's being irrational, and sometimes because she knows why she's doing it, because of the passing of her husband. And so it's like, she's like willing to let herself be, whether she realizes it or not, she's going through the grieving process, and maybe she's saying like, well, this is what I want, and this is what makes me happy, so I'll push it to this extreme. in order to get that.
So I mostly like her character. I do think she falls a little bit into the umbrella of the Manic-Pixie Dream Girl trope, in my opinion. And you would say like, well, what do you mean? How so? Well, I mean, she's obviously odd. She's got that kind of manic thing going on, and that she's got like a curious way of looking at the world. She challenges our main character, who is a man, in a way. She's definitely attractive. She's attracted to him. And then the dream girl part of it, I think, is caught up in there too, right? Like, she's beautiful. She's sex obsessed. And she's a little bit messed up, but if she can just get fixed by her protagonist, she's going to make for like the perfect girl to be with, right? So there's a little bit of that going on, but I also think that sort of reduces what is otherwise a pretty interesting dynamic created here. And so I don't know that I don't know how fair it is to level that. But yeah, I don't know. It's like, it's kind of there, but ultimately I was still able to enjoy the story, and I was still able to find her character interesting and true to life. I'm not sure that this would happen this way, but I could see it. It was enough to where I could buy that someone would be this way. So yeah, I don't know.
What did you, just specifically, what did you think of the following him and running every day and like kind of forcing herself into his life like that?
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, she becomes kind of obsessed with him in that sense. I don't know. I guess because I don't have her perspective, I didn't really understand why. Mm-hmm. Now she says later, "I'm scouting you," and we see that she's now. I guess like he's just immensely attractive, physically attractive, and he probably would be when he worked out as much as he does.
He looks like Bradley Cooper, so yeah.
Yeah, and he looks just like Bradley Cooper, so. Yeah, I don't know. Like it was fine. And I think that if we had gotten chapters from her point of view, like that would have been explained in a satisfying way, I would imagine.
I can see what you're saying though with the Manic-Pixie Dream Girl thing. It does seem like it's like it came out around that time too, right? Like that, like 2000, like mid 2000s time is like when it was like I think we're aware of it enough now to like see it and call it out, but it was like very popular during that time period, I think.
Oh, I mean, I feel like it has been popular and continues to be popular to this day. Especially a lot of a lot of fiction written by men, because it is sort of like a male wish fulfillment thing. Like, I'm gonna find this girl who's broken in all the right ways, and then I'm gonna come in and fix her, and she's gonna be the perfect match for me. Yeah, kind of thing. In a very sexualized way, Yeah, and I definitely got that from her because the implication is that she is sort of obsessed with sex now.
Well, and you can't help but feel that when it's like a male writer too. Like if it was a female writer writing this character, like you probably wouldn't feel that way.
Probably not.
Even if it was a female writer writing the perspective of a male character.
Although I don't know, because these tropes are usually perpetrated by men, but they're not always. As we've definitely learned in this country, there's a lot of this sort of stuff this sort of problematic stuff that can come from anyone, because it's ingrained in our society. And the other thing is, like, I'm not trying to slam Quick here, and I'm not trying to slam anyone who's ever put this sort of a trope in their fiction, because it can be interesting. Mm-hmm. I guess I'm just trying to say that, like, it's important to me to be aware of these things. That way, if I were to put it in my fiction, I would do it on purpose. That's kind of my goal, right? Like, I want to be in control of what I'm putting into my fiction. And the way for me to be in control of something like this is to be aware of it. And if I am completely blind to it, then what happens is you accidentally put it in there. Nobody's sitting down and saying, I'm going to put in a Manic-Pixie Dream Girl. Like, almost nobody's doing that. They're just doing it accidentally.
Right.
And so I think that's also important to remember.
Yeah, that's cool.
All right, let's get into the next section of plot here. Pat trains with Tiffany and performs a dance competition with her. After the contest, Tiffany agrees to be a go-between and gives Pat a letter supposedly written by Nikki. Pat suggests a meeting with Nikki at a place where they got engaged, and despite no reply, he slips away from his family on Christmas Day to meet her. Nikki is not there. Tiffany is, and admits she has forged Nikki's letters and that she has been trying to help Pat move on and gain closure with his marriage because she, Tiffany, is in love with Pat. Pat is furious that the last 2 months of correspondence were a lie. In shock, Pat runs into an unfamiliar neighborhood and is assaulted. By chance, he encounters Danny, his friend from the Baltimore mental health facility. Danny helps Pat get to a hospital and reunite with his family. Pat still does not recall how or why he was separated from his wife, and only when he watches the wedding video, which his mother had hidden, do the memories eventually return, with the realization that he and Nikki will never be reunited. So this covers a lot of ground in the story. I want to back up and talk about how pretty bizarre to me the dance competition stuff was in this book, because it felt like it kind of came out of nowhere. And then, like, we literally get a big dance number, like, out of it, which is so strange.
Having seen the movie, I feel like it maybe is relevant sooner in the story. The dancing is kind of relevant sooner in the story, so maybe it wasn't as jarring to me, and then knowing it was coming, I didn't even notice it in the story. But yeah, I can totally see that, how it, like, seems like it came out of nowhere. I
mean, I get it serves an interesting purpose in the story, because it does show that he's willing to give up the football, which up until this point has been such a sort of positive experience for him for the most part, and he gives that up to train for this and to achieve it, and then he has this moment where he is able to demonstrate this dance. And it's interesting because it's like, it feels very cinematic, and it feels like it was written in a way that it was like hopeful that it would be filmed or something, because I don't know, it just seems like such a visual thing. And I bet this plays really well in the movie. But for me, it was like, it was okay. It was cool to reveal that everybody was in the crowd and clapping for him and stuff. But I don't know, it wasn't as like emotionally effective of a scene as some of the other ones were.
Yeah. The thing that gets me with the dancing is that ultimately, like, he's still doing it for the wrong reasons. You know what I mean? Like, although it is helping him to move on without even realizing it, he is doing it for the, like, directly wrong reasons, because all he wants is the letter. He wants to go between. He wants to talk to Nikki. Something that I was just thinking about is, so we talked about the letters are pure fiction from Tiffany. She recommends a couple of books for him to read, and I think one of them is Huck Finn and the other is Catcher in the Rye.
Yeah,
which I think is interesting, because it's like she's recommending certain books because she's hoping that he will respond to them, putting his own life on those stories and thinking of it in that sort of sense.
Which, I don't know, I loved all those sections where we were getting sort of his descriptions of these books, and like the bell jar and all these different ones. It was really interesting. Oh, so before we get past it, the football in this story, I was like, okay, he's setting it up to where his life is going to be kind of in parallel to the Eagles season, right? We'd see the ups and downs. We'd hear about Hank, and particularly Hank Baskett, and like how well he was doing seemed to be reflective of how well Pat was doing in his life, and you know, their wins and losses, and they go on a 3-game losing streak when he goes and trains. Like, it felt like cosmically these two were linked in the story. And that progresses all the way to the end, where they play a very important game on Christmas, and a very important moment happens in Pat's life, right? And then they come out victorious, and they're going to the playoffs, I assume. And then at first I was frustrated that we didn't get resolution for like what happens after that, and like, do the Eagles go on to the Super Bowl or not? I could look it up, obviously, because this was based on a real season.
Spoiler,
I couldn't remember, but I didn't think so. I came back around and I thought, okay, we're not getting the resolution of this football season, but we also don't know how Pat's life works out. We don't get like a long epilogue where it describes how Tiffany and him are happy together and, you know, living fine, and they're both well now. Like, we don't get any of that. They might be just as fucked up. They just have like a moment at the end of the book.
Right.
And that's all we really get. And so I felt like it was actually fitting in retrospect to not tell us how the season ultimately played out.
Yeah, I like that. That's cool. And it's like but I think that moment is obviously enough for us to say he's moved on. His life is going to continue instead of being stuck in this like continuous rut here.
Let me read the last section of plot here, just because we're talking about it. After several weeks, Pat recovers from his injuries, and after receiving a letter, agrees to meet Tiffany. Pat explains that he asked his brother Jake to drive him to see Nikki and observed her from afar, finally realizing that she has a new family and is happy, and thus accepts it as the ending of the movie of his life. Tiffany gives Pat a cloud chart as a belated birthday present, and they lie on the ground and watch the clouds together. Pat pulls Tiffany close, and she tells him that she needs him. As they lie there on a frozen soccer field in the middle of a snowstorm, Pat kisses her and says, "I think I need you too." Okay, so that's where the book ends. And it is kind of a sweet moment. To back up a little bit, what did you think about this whole thing with him running and getting assaulted and then waking up and finding Ronnie?
Yeah, I was thinking that it was going to be he got jumped, like he was assaulted, and then it was going to have been some sort of like hate crime or something. Like it was like specific, like a targeted thing or something. I don't know why. I just felt like because it was so much about mental illness, I thought maybe it would be something like that. But it doesn't really make sense to the character because it's not like he has that sort of mental illness.
Right.
It's not as outward as that.
Yeah, you probably couldn't unless it's the Giants fan back for revenge.
Yeah. Yeah, I didn't really know what to make of that. I think that it's just like him, maybe it's like he had caused harm to others, so maybe like that full circle of him also getting beaten up was part of like his process of pushing through and kind of coming back to kind of moving on with his life.
It was a little bit unbelievable to me. It felt very, very like this is what I want to have happen for the plot. But like if you think about it, he was like sprinting through like downtown Philadelphia essentially, and yeah, sure, maybe it was a bad, quote unquote, bad part of town, but someone who's like full on running, I feel like is pretty unlikely to get attacked, because that person is like, you have to like run over and try and intercept them and like to like try and trip him, I guess is what happened, and then he got beat up and robbed. Like it just seems like such a bad target for any sort of this sort of thing. It just seems incredibly unlikely. It also felt like a weird fever dream to me, because he wakes up and he sees Ronnie, and I'm like, oh, he's totally hallucinating this. But then I guess he's not. It is Ronnie, who just happened to be there when he like woke up from being assaulted. So bizarre. And then they lampshade it by saying like, this is the sort of thing that happens in a movie. Which I was like, okay, I guess he's trying to say that like ultimately this is a quote unquote movie, although it's a book, and that this story is like that. So I guess it worked okay for me, but it just felt pretty out there.
Yeah, I didn't really understand what, other than what I said, like what I'm like kind of trying to pull from it. I didn't really understand the reasoning behind him getting hurt like that.
That's it. Wait, is it Ronnie or Danny? Because he has another friend, Ronnie.
Danny. It's Danny.
It's Danny. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that part was weird, but ultimately, whatever. Now I do want to talk about the ending here. It was mostly good, but once again, it felt a little bit tropey. Maybe just because I've seen like other movies that do this. But the laying on the ground, looking up at the sky. It's also like super cold. They're in the snow. It's snowing on them. I feel like people don't do this very often in real life because it's just too uncomfortable to do that when it's that cold.
Well, they made a point of saying like, I don't know anyone else who would do this with me, kind of like in order to say like
for good reason.
Yeah.
They're looking up at the blanket of gray clouds. It's a very like literary ending to me, which I fit the book okay. It's funny because I sound like I guess I'm just nitpicking because that's like what we do on the podcast, right?
Yeah.
But ultimately, I liked it. It was fine, and I thought it had that heartwarming note at the end, which I guess backs up what's on the cover, right? It does feel heartwarming at the very end.
I think it'll be interesting once we see the film to hear where you land on it. But I think that I enjoy the film a little more, if only for the fact that I think that the story is messy, and maybe that's by design.
Well, I mean, I don't know. I haven't seen it yet, but we are going to be watching it this next week, and it's we're getting into February here soon, and it's going to be that time of year. Love is going to be in the air, and
So
whatever.
does this feel to you like a romantic comedy with like some mental illness thrown into it?
No. I feel like this is a much deeper story than that.
Yeah.
And I like that, and I like the story ultimately, and there's enough going on here to where like this is the kind of romance I really enjoy, in a sense that it's messy and it's true to life in a lot of ways. Yeah, I don't know. I guess this just appeals to me, and so I'm glad we're covering it this time of year.
Yeah, I want to mention a movie that it kind of evokes to me, but it's like I would say a little bit lesser version just because I really enjoy this movie, but something about it reminds me of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
It's the laying on a frozen thing and looking at the sky.
There is a little bit of that,
lake.
but it's also like the characters dealing with their internal like struggling and grappling with like their own feelings in the way that they're, because like he in Eternal Sunshine he wants her back, and like he just can't cope with not having her, and I think that's like kind of like the same thing with the Pat and Nikki relationship.
I can see why you would make that comparison, and honestly, I did think of it, and to me at first I thought like it was just that like surface level laying on the frozen thing, looking at the sky. But you're right, there's a lot thematically that actually kind of overlaps with that, and I agree that is superior because that's one of my favorite movies. I don't know if you know this about me. I don't know if we've talked about it. But if I had to list like top 10 for sure, I think that would be in there.
It's a great film. Yeah,
I love that movie. And yeah, I can see some overlap. I haven't seen the movie yet for this one, so we'll see. Maybe the movie's like incredible in a different way. But yeah, that's going to be a tall order to try and live up to that film for me. But we shall see.
Now I feel like I may be overhyping it a little bit. Just I don't want you to think that it's going to be Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, your favorite movie, but it's a solid film. I just thought that there's like interesting parallels.
So I think one way to end this thing will be to talk about depressing fiction and why we read it. But I think let's save that for the very end and revisit just to cap this thing off. Okay,
that sounds good. If you guys wanted to find us on social media, we're on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. All of those are at Ink2Film. And we have a Facebook group called the Council of Inklings where you can come and join us. We have polls and we post things about upcoming adaptations and things that we're interested in. So come check that out.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank Stephen E. again for commissioning this, essentially, and being a jukebox hero. And I hope that you enjoy this coverage, and I hope that you enjoy next week. And yeah, thank you again. And if anybody wants to learn about that and how the process to get your own episodes, go to patreon.com/Ink2Film.
Another way you could help out the podcast is leaving a rating or review on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Yeah, and we wanted to shout out Jen again for being our transcriptionist, and she's writing this down right now, which I thought about a couple times while we were doing this episode, and it felt weird, but I'm sure I'll get used to it. But yeah, thank you for everything you're doing for us. We really appreciate it.
And we wanted to thank Ross Bugden for the use of our intro and outro music.
All right, man. So I want to talk about this because I think this is this is probably too much to talk about at the end of an episode like this, but just briefly, like, what did you think about the discussion of why depressing fiction is important?
Well, I have a quick answer for it, I feel like. So for me, the way that I've always approached stories is it's like, these are other lives that you're living. And you're not going to be able to, this is the only way that you can experience this many things in your life. You can experience things that you'll never experience in your actual everyday life. So for me, like experiencing sad or like really heavy topics and having to empathize with a character that's going through these things is the reason to do it, because I think the more empathy that you have, the more fulfilling your life will be. And I think in general, it's just like having those different stories to pull from, and they're almost like life experiences for yourself. So that's where I'm at on that.
Yeah, I mean, I like that, and that's the take that this book seems to take too. And the idea of empathy, I think, is key. So if you can imagine a person, this is a hypothetical fictional person. If you can imagine a person who says to you, I don't ever watch or read anything that is dark or depressing. I don't like that stuff. I don't ever consume it. And all they ever read or consume is happy endings, happy stories, happy movies, and whatever. I feel like I would think that person is probably less empathetic. You know what I mean? And I might be wrong, but I think I would assume that person isn't as empathetic as like someone who does. Because I agree. I think that stuff like that can teach you empathy. Now, it's not to say that you have to fully immerse yourself in those kind of stories to learn empathy. I just think that I think there can be a nice mix of that. And I worry about that sometimes when I see really powerful and like loud movements in the literary community on like Twitter and stuff of people saying like, we need positive fiction, we need fiction that, and people kind of like being highly critical of dark stories and highly critical of depressing fiction and saying like, real life is depressing enough. I don't need depressing shit in my fiction. I don't need dark shit in my fiction, what have you. I get it, but I also worry because I feel like depressing fiction is important, and I feel like it does not only teach empathy, but I think it can also give you a sense of being understood. And if you're going through dark things in your life, it can make you feel like other people get it, and other people see that life is dark, and other people understand my pain, in whatever fictionalized sense. And so I don't know. I guess I'm always hesitant, and I'm always kind of skeptical of these pushes, and I wonder how. I don't know. Like, is it really a good thing to be pushing for? I guess is what I'm saying. I don't know.
To be pushing for only good things, yeah. I mean, I think you just write your truth, right? I think if something's coming out of you and it's positive, write that. And if something's coming out of you and it's negative, I think there's a place for that as well.
I don't think one side is inherently better than the other.
Right.
I think there's a place for both. And I think, often the push for positive fiction is made from a sense of like, hey, we want room at the table for this too, because it feels like all sorts of fiction is dark nowadays. And I think that's totally fair to push for that and say like, hey, this is important too. And it is. I just would caution against going so far in one direction that you're saying that all fiction that's dark or depressing has no value or shouldn't be written or what have you, or shouldn't exist. And I think that's where it's like, I don't know if I agree with that.
Yeah, I get that. But with that, I think that we should wrap the episode here. It's been a lot of fun covering this book. I'm looking forward to covering the film next week.
Absolutely. I think I told you in something bonus episode or something that I just watched, or maybe it was last week, that I just watched A Star Is Born with Bradley Cooper. Mm-hmm. So I'm excited to get back into the Bradley Cooper fandom and see what he was like in 2013. And yeah, I don't know. I'm into it and I'm looking forward to it. But until next time.
Thanks for listening.